morning. This is a live look over Tel Aviv there in Israel as folks are still on alert. Now, we are learning this morning that Israeli security officials say the country's Mossad spy agency actually smuggled weapons into Iran ahead of the strikes that were used to target its defenses from within. Two security officials spoke to the Associated Press to talk about the highly secretive missions. It was not possible, though, for the Associated Press to independently confirm the claims. The officials said that a base for launching explosive devices was established inside of Iran, and the drones there were activated during the attack to target missile launchers at an Iranian base near Tehran. They said Israel had also smuggled precision weapons into central Iran and positioned them near surface-to-air missile systems. They said it also deployed strike systems on vehicles. Both were activated as the strikes began to target Iran's defenses. Again, that is according to officials that spoke to the Associated Press. We do have several live images that we are showing you right now. This is out of Tel Aviv over in Israel. As you can see, for the most part right now, the sirens there are dying down. Things are remaining quiet, but we're keeping an eye on the situation after everything that has developed over the past several hours. Now, a lot to discuss, no question, so I do want to head over to Israel and bring in Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. As always, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
My pleasure. Always good to be with you.
And first off, before we talk about the situation in general that has played out, I did want to ask you, because again, you're over in Israel. So explain what the situation is on the ground there.
It's remarkably quiet. We had a little bit of a jarring evening, somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning local time here in Jerusalem. I first heard a siren sort of off in the distance, and it woke me up. And my first thought with this was probably just another Houthi missile that was coming in. These are usually one and done. But then my phone started blaring, and I looked down at the messages, and there was something from the Home Front Command here in Israel, and they were saying that across the entire country, everyone was being told to go into shelter. So I'm at a hotel here in Jerusalem. We went into a stairwell, waiting for further instruction. We sat there for a good hour or so, and then actually went down to a protected space that's 3 stories below ground, sat there for a bit, and then we began to get news that it did not look like there was going to be an Iranian response. And so folks went up to their rooms and went about their business. I think everybody was a little jarred, probably a little tired. But, you know, life seems to go on right now. I see cars on the streets here in Jerusalem. I see people walking around. That's not what Home Front Command is I think, suggesting. They want folks to stay relatively close to their protected shelter areas, and to keep food and other things nearby in the event of an attack. But from what we can tell, what is being broadcast here and what is being broadcast in Iran, what we're seeing from around the world, is that Israel carried out a remarkable attack last night. They neutralized a great number of the ballistic missiles that Iran had prepared to fire at Israel. They took out the drones that Iran had fired in response to the attack. But I think most importantly, from the Israeli perspective, they appeared to have thwarted a nuclear breakout. In other words, it appears that Iran may have decided that, as talks with Donald Trump and Stephen Witkoff, that as those talks started to stall, that this was their time to break out for a bomb. And that was something that the Israelis were never going to let happen. They've been vowing to stop that for 15 years. And it looks like last night they put their money where their mouths have been. And that is that's the story now. Perhaps the only thing I could add is that there are a number of senior leaders of the Iranian military, of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that have been eliminated as well. So there was a decapitation strike that took place as well. So again, a lot of chaos right now in Iran. I was seeing reports this morning that people are lining up, trying to get food, trying to get there's a lot of panic there. And I compare that to what's happening here in Israel, and it's really quite a stark contrast.
And what you're looking at right now, you were just talking about that, but some of the top military officials that were killed there in the strike, it seems as though they were targeted specifically to minimize the damage, according to the IDF, and death of civilians, things of that nature. But how would you overall, and you touched on this, but how would you characterize the success of the strike, both tactically and strategically?
So, I mean, I think from the perspective of what they targeted, the people that they targeted in the regime, I think this was hugely important. Decapitation strikes. They went after top nuclear scientists. They went after people that were senior people in the nuclear program. They went after the military strategists. In other words, really the brain trust of the regime. I think that's important because it's so in chaos right now inside the Islamic Republic, and I'm not sure they know who is in charge or how to respond. They have struck the Natanz nuclear facility. From what I understand, it has not been destroyed, but that it has been crippled. That's important because we're probably looking at Israel perhaps having bought a year or more time in terms of a possible Iranian breakout. There are other strikes that are ongoing, multiple waves of strikes, and I understand that there may be strikes happening as we speak, with the Israelis, I think, refueling and sending those F-35s back out into Iranian airspace to attack more targets. But a lot of this also, Josh, is about destroying the ballistic missiles that were pre-positioned to be able to hit Israel. In other words, Iran had an attack plan. They had launchers on the western side of the country that would take less time to get to Israel. The launchers have been destroyed. A lot of the missile silos have been destroyed. I don't know how to quantify it yet because the Israelis are not quantifying it, at least not that I've seen, but they have taken out a lot of the offensive capabilities that the regime has, and it appears that they have set back the nuclear program and prevented a dash to a bomb. For me, I have to say, the big question is there are still facilities that are buried deep beneath the ground. And the Israelis, at least as I understand it, don't have the capability to destroy what is deep beneath the ground because they don't have the bombers and they don't have the heavy munitions that are necessary to finish the job. That's something that the U.S. has. And right now, at least from what we're seeing, the Trump administration has disavowed the operation. They've said that they don't, that they didn't take part in it. I've seen conflicting reports about whether they knew in advance or not. But I do think that there's kind of an open question now as to whether the administration decides, okay, we're going to finish this, we're going to mop it up, or whether they go back and they start talking to the Iranians again to say, look, you've been hurt, you've been crippled. This is the time to wave the white flag to end your nuclear program. That's where the leverage is. I don't know which way they go right now. I'm sure there's a debate happening right now at the White House, at the Situation Room. I'm sure they're still talking about that at this moment. But in the meantime, the nuclear talks that were scheduled on Sunday in Oman between the U.S. and Iran, they've been canceled, not a surprise. And everything seems to be in suspension while the Israelis continue their work from the air.
One thing that's interesting, you touched on this here, President Trump, his administration, the U.S. in general, there are kind of conflicting reports as to whether they did know in advance that this was going to happen. We also know at 11 a.m. Eastern time, that is when we expect President Trump to meet there with the National Security Council. Obviously, classified information going to be discussed. Cameras not allowed inside. It is a closed-door meeting. But how significant is it to see President Trump meeting with the National Security Council on this just hours after the attack? What does that say?
Well, I mean, it says that we're at a potential crisis, right? I mean, the Iranians, I think, fully believe that that the U.S. was complicit in some way. And let's be clear. I mean, the Israelis are using American munitions. They're using American platforms. And we all know that the Israelis coordinate very closely in terms of intelligence. I'm sure that whatever the Israelis saw in terms of a possible Iranian breakout, they shared it with the United States. The U.S. was probably able to confirm it. I heard rumblings here that they didn't get into specifics with me, and probably for good reason, but they said that something had happened recently recently that had caused significant concern in both systems, in both the U.S. and Israeli systems. So, I think we now know probably what that is. They were speaking very euphemistically. Now I think we probably have a better sense. But I do think there is an open question for the Trump administration about how much they want to get involved. We continue to hear from at least certain individuals inside the administration that they want to keep their powder dry for a possible confrontation with China, that Middle East conflicts seem like a diversion of resources or a distraction. I happen to think in this case, the removal of a nuclear threat from one of China and Russia's top allies, I actually see the strategic wisdom of getting involved on a limited basis for the U.S. if the administration is inclined to do it. But in the meantime, I think it's safe to say that the Israelis have done remarkable work here. The only other thing that I might add, Josh, about this is, as we understand it, the Israelis were able to assemble a forward base of operatives with drones, and that those drones were apparently involved in the targeting of some of these top officials and some of these nuclear sites and some of these military sites. This is remarkably similar to what we saw coming out of Russia not too long ago with the Ukrainians pulling off a very similar operation. I don't know whether there's a connection, but I would say that it's hard to ignore the interconnectivity of all of these fronts that we're watching right now as embattled democracies try to fend off aggressive enemy actors that are aligned against the United States and their allies.
And what you're looking at on your screen is actually a live look at a Baghdad, Iraq at this hour here. It's the fortified green zone area, which is, for folks not familiar with that, where the U.S. Embassy is located. Iraq saying that more than 100 Iranian drones crossed its airspace. What is the role here in other maybe surrounding areas as they do see these drones fly overhead? Do they just ignore it? Do they take part in shooting them down? How does all of that kind of work?
Well, we have CENTCOM, Central Command. That is the U.S. military command that is responsible for the Middle East. They have been on high alert. We actually know that they were on high alert even maybe 24 hours before this strike took place. You may recall that there were orders that were handed down to all of the surrounding bases in the region, and all of the embassies where officials were told to stay near a shelter, to have food and water prepared, that there were potential activities or threats that were coming. We didn't know what they were, but apparently the U.S. had some inkling of it. CENTCOM was undoubtedly involved in spreading that alert around the region. I do think that we saw at least the Jordanians shooting down drones that entered into their airspace. It's actually, at the end of the day, it is the responsibility, it's the right of every country anywhere around the world to shoot down things that enter into their airspace that are not authorized. So we can say with certainty that the Jordanians have done this. Wouldn't be surprised if we saw the Saudis take out certain threats from the air. Maybe the Iraqis too, for that matter. These are all countries that are at least technically part of the U.S.-led alliance, some more committed to it than others. I think Iraq is kind of a holdout. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians are close partners with the United States. But I think we have an entire region right now that is on alert. Interestingly, though, General Kurilla, the head of the general in charge of Central Command, just canceled his visit to Israel, probably for safety concerns. But we do get a sense that the coordination right now is intense and ongoing.
All right. Jonathan Schanzer there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say this. This was so predictable. In fact, you could have predicted it 15 years ago. The Iranian regime has continued to test its limits with the international community, but also with Israel, and probably specifically with Israel, because they have called for Israel's destruction repeatedly. They have armed proxies all around Israel's borders. And they have waged an asymmetric war against Israel, and they've never paid a significant price. After October 7th, Hamas, of course, is an Iranian proxy. They drew blood. And then we began to see attacks from Hezbollah, from Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, from the Houthis in Yemen. All of these actors are Iran backed, every one of them. And so the Israelis had no doubt in their mind that the Iranians were behind the war that has now been raging for 600 days. There were a few tussles between the Iranian regime and Israel, one back in April of last year, and then again in October, where the Iranians attacked Israel and then the Israelis responded in kind. This was a long time in the making, and the Israelis have finally, at least for now, set back the Iranians and delivered, I think, the kind of message that maybe should have been delivered a long time ago, but I think they've been listening here in Israel to the international community, calling for calm, calling for caution. But I think right now, as the 60-day deadline for nuclear talks ended, today is literally day 61 after those 60 days that Donald Trump had said that the Iranians had, they had the 60 days. They failed to deliver a deal in those 60 days. And it does look like the Israelis said, okay, time's up.
And of course, that's important to mention that it is day 61 of that 60-day conversation there. Thank you so much, Jonathan Schanzer, for taking the time to join us and help break all of this down. Obviously, a lot to it. I do want to say, since you are there in Israel, please stay safe. But thank you again for taking the time to be here.
Thanks for having me.